I never imagined that the twilight years of my life would be spent this way, in a house that has grown too quiet, in a town that seems to shrink around me with every passing season. My name is Richard Mallory. I am 76 years old, and for the past 11 years, ever since my wife Catherine passed away, I have been living alone in the same modest, one-story house where we raised our children. The silence in these rooms is not the gentle, restful kind one sometimes craves after a long day, but a silence that feels like abandonment, like a reminder of everything that has been taken from me by time and by the indifference of those who should have cared the most. When I wake up each morning, the house no longer smells of Catherine's pancakes or fresh coffee, but only of dust, old furniture, and the faint must of loneliness. I still brew myself a cup, not because I need it, but because the ritual of pouring water, measuring the grounds, and waiting for the gurgle of the old machine gives me the illusion that life has some order left in it. I try to keep my days filled with small routines, though I admit they are mostly ways to avoid staring too long into the void of my own thoughts. I sweep the porch, even if it hardly gets dirty. I water the same flowers Catherine once planted, though most of them have withered and left only stubborn weeds. And I sit by the window pretending to read, while really I just watch the street. The neighborhood has changed. Most of the old families moved away years ago, and the younger people who live here now rush past me with headphones in their ears and phones in their hands, too busy to notice the gray-haired man sitting alone behind the glass. When they do glance at me, I can almost hear what they must be thinking. Another relic of a world they don't care to remember, someone waiting for his time to run out. But it isn't the neighbor's indifference that weighs on me most heavily. It's the neglect of my own family. I raised 2 children, and I believed, perhaps foolishly, that the love Catherine and I poured into them would return in our old age as simple care and respect. My son Paul moved west long ago, chasing a career in real estate in California. He calls once or twice a year, always with the same rehearsed cheerfulness, always ending the conversation quickly because, as he says, "Dad, I'm late for a meeting." My daughter Elaine stayed closer to home, only 2 towns over, and for a long time I thought that proximity would mean I would not be forgotten. But in truth, she has been the source of the sharpest disappointment. After Catherine's funeral, Elaine became distant, as though grief excused her from responsibility. And as the years went on, I realized her calls were not about my well-being, but about what I might provide her. Loans to cover debts, help with the grandchildren's expenses, promises that never seemed to be kept once the check cleared. I gave, because that is what fathers do. I gave, because Catherine would have wanted me to. She believed in family as if it were a sacred covenant, and she raised our children to believe they could rely on us. I cannot count how many times I told myself that writing another check, selling a small bond, or dipping into my retirement savings was simply my way of keeping Catherine's vision alive. But with every transaction, with every hollow thank you that quickly faded into silence, I felt something in me corrode. I began to understand that what I mistook for family ties was often nothing more than financial convenience for them. Still, I endured it, because what else was left to me except the illusion that I still mattered to someone? Elaine has a husband, Patrick, a man of easy smiles and restless eyes, the kind of fellow who always seems to be calculating the next advantage. From the moment I met him, I sensed that his politeness was a thin layer over disdain, but Catherine urged me to give him a chance. For her sake, I did. Over the years, I realized he looked at me not as a father-in-law, but as an asset, something to be tapped, managed, eventually discarded. Their children, my grandchildren, used to visit when they were younger, but as they grew older, they followed their parents' example. Occasional greetings on holidays, hurried hugs, then back to their screens, their friends, their lives. I cannot blame them entirely. They learned from their mother that I was not someone to be cherished, but someone to be tolerated when convenient. Age has a way of stripping a man down, not only in strength, but in dignity. I used to be a school principal, a man whose word carried authority, whose presence in a room commanded attention. Now I am the one shuffled aside, told gently to sit down, told to let the younger generation handle things, as if the decades I lived and the lessons I learned are nothing but outdated clutter. My knees ache, my back stiffens in the morning, and I sometimes lose my balance when climbing the porch steps. But my mind is sharp. I read the newspaper daily, follow politics, even keep up with some technology. I know when I am being patronized, and I know when I am being lied to. The cruelest truth I face each day is that my daughter seems to think otherwise, that age alone makes me incapable, that gray hair equals incompetence, and that my signature on a bank document or deed is something she should have the right to claim. Before death takes me, this summer has been merciless. The heat settled over Iowa like a heavy blanket, day after day, of 95, 100, 105 degrees. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt and sends the elderly collapsing in their homes. I tried to manage running the old window unit in my bedroom, even though it rattled and barely cooled the air, drinking water until my stomach sloshed, sitting still to avoid sweating myself into exhaustion. Each time the news reported another senior who had died alone in his house from the heat, I felt a chill, as if the anchor were reading my own obituary in advance. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that Elaine would check on me during those weeks. A phone call, a visit, even a text message. Days went by with nothing. When she finally appeared at my door, I felt a flicker of hope. She stood there in her pressed blouse, sunglasses perched on her head, her smile practiced but not warm. Patrick was idling in the car, the engine running, the air conditioner blasting for his comfort, while I stood sweating in the doorway. "Dad," she said brightly, "why don't you come with us today? A little shopping, a chance to get out of the house, it'll do you good." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that this was a rare act of kindness, a small recognition that I was still part of her world. I grabbed my hat, my wallet, and locked the door behind me, telling myself that maybe the tide was turning. Maybe Elaine had remembered she had a father who longed for more than transactions and obligations. I did not yet know that what awaited me that day would be the most humiliating and terrifying experience of my life, one that would strip away the last illusions I held about family and force me to fight, not for affection. That battle was long, lost, but for dignity, survival, and justice. I had endured neglect before. I had endured loneliness. But nothing prepared me for the cruelty of being treated not even as a burden, but as something less than human, left to bake inside a metal coffin under the blazing sun, while those I loved most in this world laughed and walked away. When Elaine coaxed me into their car that morning, I told myself not to be suspicious, not to look for hidden motives in what might have been a simple invitation. Patrick sat at the wheel with his usual smirk, his fingers tapping the steering wheel, as if even the act of driving me across town was a burden he resented. The cool blast of the air conditioning hit me like a wave when I stepped inside, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a trace of relief from the relentless heat that had seeped into my bones. I said thank you, quietly, perhaps too quietly for either of them to hear, but gratitude was what I felt at that moment. We drove along the familiar roads toward the shopping district, Elaine chatting about new furniture they were considering buying, about how expensive groceries had become, about how the grandchildren were out with friends and rarely home. I listened, nodding, though her words carried no invitation for me to participate. I was not part of her life, only a passenger listening to her monologue, a piece of background noise. When we pulled into the sprawling lot of the shopping center, I expected them to park and for us to walk together through the air-conditioned stores. Instead, Patrick swung into a shaded corner, though by shaded, I mean only that one small, thin tree cast a flimsy line across the hood. The sun was brutal even at mid-morning, the kind of sun that baked asphalt until it gave off a smell like burning tar. Elaine turned to me with a bright smile, but it was the sort of brightness that came too quickly, like a mask slipping into place. "Dad," she said, "we just need to run inside for a bit. You stay here. We'll be quick. It'll be easier for you than walking around in this heat." I was startled. Why would I stay in the car? "I can walk slowly. I'm fine," I said, my hand already on the door handle. But she reached across and touched my wrist with a firmness that was not affectionate. "Please, Dad, don't make this harder. You'll be more comfortable here." "We won't be long," Patrick added. "And besides, you'll only get tired. We'll pick up what we need faster if you stay put." His words carried the tone of someone speaking to a child who insists on coming along to a place he doesn't belong. I wanted to argue, to demand that they let me join them, but in that moment, my old habit of trying to keep the peace won out. I thought of Catherine, and how she always told me to avoid quarrels, to choose patience over pride, and against my instincts, I sank back into the seat. Elaine reached into her purse, pulled out my phone, and with a soft laugh said, "Let me hold on to this for you, Dad. You always lose track of it." I protested weakly that I had never once lost my phone, but she had already dropped it into her bag. Before I could object further, the doors slammed, and they walked away hand in hand, leaving me inside. At first, I told myself it would be a matter of minutes, perhaps 15 or 20 at most. The car still held the cold air from the air conditioning, and I sat back, closing my eyes, telling myself not to overreact. But as the minutes dragged on, that coolness dissipated quickly, replaced by a suffocating thickness that clung to my skin. I rolled my sleeve up, tried to open a window, but found that Patrick had locked the controls, The doors, too, refused to yield. When I pulled the handle, I realized with a jolt of disbelief that I was locked inside. The sun shifted, and the thin line of shade abandoned the car, leaving the vehicle exposed. Heat surged through the metal, turning the interior into a furnace. My shirt clung to me with sweat. My mouth grew parched, and I began to feel the dull pounding of my pulse in my temples. I glanced out through the glass, hoping to see Elaine and Patrick returning, but they were nowhere in sight. People walked past, some glancing briefly in my direction, but no one stopped. To them, I was just an old man, waiting for his family, not someone silently pleading for air. I knocked once against the window, tentatively, then louder, but the noise was lost in the roar of the traffic and the distance of the lot. Time warped in that suffocating enclosure. Each minute stretched unbearably. My throat ached for water, my chest felt heavy, and my hands trembled when I wiped the sweat that dripped into my eyes. I thought of dogs left in cars during heat waves, the news stories that condemned such cruelty, and the realization struck me with merciless clarity. My daughter and her husband had chosen to treat me worse than they would treat an animal. They had made a decision, not careless, not accidental, but deliberate, to place me in that metal cage, to deprive me of movement, to strip me of dignity, and to leave me vulnerable to the elements. I tried to reason with myself, to imagine that perhaps they had been delayed by long lines or distracted by errands. But beneath that fragile hope was a heavier truth, one that pressed against my ribs as relentlessly as the heat. Elaine and Patrick wanted me incapacitated, humiliated, dependent. They wanted me to appear feeble, confused, incapable of caring for myself. Each bead of sweat, each labored breath was not just a consequence of weather, but a weapon wielded by their negligence. I remembered Catherine in those moments. How she used to fan herself with a newspaper during hot summers. How she insisted on pouring glasses of lemonade for me even when I said I wasn't thirsty. How she scolded me if I stayed too long in the sun. She had protected me, always, in small ways and large, and now her absence burned sharper than the sun itself. What would she think if she saw our daughter leaving me here, locked in, as though I were nothing but an inconvenience? The shame of it was worse than the suffocation, a shame that curled inside me like fire. My body grew weaker as the minutes passed, and my thoughts began to fragment. I could feel my heart thudding irregularly, and a haze settled across my vision. I imagined myself slumping forward, unconscious, discovered too late with Elaine's words. To the paramedics rehearsed already. He must have gotten confused. He locked himself in. They would shake their heads, pity the poor old man, and believe her. The narrative was ready, simple, and convenient. Age as an excuse, confusion as a cover. Negligence disguised as inevitability. The truth, however, was searing through me with the clarity of the sun itself. I was not confused. I was not lost. I was trapped deliberately by my own family, and as the heat clawed at me, as the car became an oven around my weakening body, a slow, smoldering anger began to take root inside me, anger that somehow, against all odds, would outlast the suffocation of that day. I do not remember the exact moment when discomfort turned into danger, because heat is a gradual executioner, stealing strength inch by inch until even the will to fight is dulled. At first, it was only sweat soaking through my shirt, trickling into my collar, stinging my eyes. I dabbed at it with my handkerchief, still clinging to the idea that Elaine and Patrick would reappear, bags in hand, apologetic for taking too long. Then the air seemed to grow thick, not merely hot but dense, as though invisible hands were pressing against my chest, compressing my lungs with every breath. My tongue swelled against the roof of my mouth, thirst becoming an agony sharper than hunger. I looked around the parking lot, scanning for a familiar face, for anyone who might notice the old man. Imprisoned in a modern chariot of steel and glass, but most people averted their eyes. A few glanced casually, shrugged, and kept walking, perhaps assuming that I was simply waiting, that the situation was not theirs to question. The indifference of strangers pierced me almost as deeply as the betrayal of my own child. I shifted uncomfortably, the seat leather scalding against my thighs, my hands burning when they touched the metal buckle of the belt. I tugged at my collar, gasping, my vision blurring as heat waves distorted the world beyond the windshield. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, but the handles refused to yield. The windows refused to roll down, and the oppressive stillness inside the car made me feel like a specimen sealed in a jar. My pulse throbbed so loudly in my ears that I feared I might faint, and with fainting would come the end. Quiet and ignominious, my last breath drawn in a stifling prison, built not by fate, but by my daughter's choice. It was in those moments of helplessness that something colder than heat settled into me, a realization far more painful than the physical ordeal. I was no longer seen as a father, not even as a human being with desires and dignity, but as an inconvenience, an obstacle, perhaps even a liability. Elaine and Patrick had left me there, not because they forgot, not because they miscalculated the weather, but because in their eyes I was already half gone, a fragile, doddering old man who could be treated like excess baggage. Perhaps they even thought that if I weakened, if I collapsed, it would strengthen their case that I was incompetent, that I could no longer live alone, that control of my house and my savings must be transferred into their hands for my so-called protection. The thought burned more fiercely than the sun outside, a betrayal so calculated that it hollowed me out. My head grew heavy, my thoughts slippery, yet some small corner of me clung stubbornly to defiance. I told myself I would not die like this. I would not give Elaine and Patrick the satisfaction of finding me slumped, lifeless, a convenient confirmation of their lies. I beat my palm against the window, harder this time, ignoring the pain. Most passers-by ignored me, but one man slowed, frowning, uncertain whether to involve himself. He hesitated, started to walk away, then returned and tapped on the glass. I must have looked wild, my face red, my lips cracked, because his eyes widened in alarm. He gestured for me to unlock the door, and I shook my head, mouthing the word locked. He pulled at the handle, cursed when it held fast, and then ran off, his voice carrying faintly as he shouted for help. I drifted in and out of clarity as the minutes stretched, but eventually The door yanked open from the outside, and a rush of hot but moving air hit me like salvation. Two men stood there, one the passerby who had noticed, the other a security guard from the shopping center. Their hands were firm under my arms, lifting me gently, coaxing me from the oven that had nearly cooked me alive. My knees buckled, the ground tilted, and only their grip kept me from collapsing entirely. Someone pressed a cold bottle of water to my lips, and I drank greedily, the liquid scorching down my throat with relief so intense it bordered on pain. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder, until the ambulance pulled up beside us. I remember fragments. The paramedics strapping me to a stretcher, checking my pulse, muttering about heat stroke, one of them shaking his head with quiet disbelief that anyone could be left in a car on a day like this. I wanted to tell them everything, to explain that this was not an accident, but cruelty, deliberate and planned, but the words tangled in my throat. My body was too weak, my mind too muddled, and all I managed was a rasp that sounded more like a sigh. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights stung my eyes. The cold of the IV seeped into my veins, and gradually, mercifully, my thoughts began to clear. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, explained that my core temperature had been dangerously high, that another half hour in that car might have been fatal. She spoke gently, as though afraid the truth might shatter me, but I already knew how close I had come. What struck me more than her words was the sudden appearance of Elaine at my bedside, her expression arranged into one of frantic concern. She clutched my hand, smoothed my hair, her voice dripping with a sweetness I had not heard in years. "Oh, Daddy," she cried, "what on earth were you thinking, locking yourself in the car like that? You scared us half to death." Her lie was so smooth, so immediate, that the nurse beside her seemed to accept it. Without question, I tried to protest, tried to shake my head, but my throat was raw, my words barely whispers. Elaine leaned closer, her smile soft, but her eyes hard, warning me not to contradict her. "He gets confused sometimes," she told the doctor. "It's been happening more often lately. He forgets things, misplaces objects, even imagines things that didn't happen. Patrick and I have been so worried." In that moment, the heat that had nearly killed me was replaced by a cold, furious clarity. She was laying the groundwork, building the case that I was incompetent, that I was slipping into dementia, that I could not be trusted with my own life or possessions. My near death was not a tragedy to her. It was an opportunity, a tool to tighten the noose around my independence. I stared at her, my daughter, the girl Catherine and I had raised with love and sacrifice, and I realized she was now my enemy, not in a childish sense of quarrel or misunderstanding, but in the truest sense. She intended to strip me of my autonomy, to erase me as a man, and relegate me to property to be managed. As I lay there, tethered to tubes and monitors, listening to Elaine weave her false narrative with the easy confidence of someone who has rehearsed it many times before, I felt something awaken in me. It was not despair, not even grief, though both would have been justified. It was anger, deep and molten, the kind of anger that gives a man strength long after his body has failed. I swore to myself that I would not allow them to win, that I would not slip quietly into the role of helpless dependent, that I would fight, even if the battle drained the last reserves of my life. The heat had nearly killed me, but in that crucible, a different kind of fire had been forged inside me, and it was one they could never extinguish. The days after the hospital nearly blended together, yet beneath the routine of tests and whispered conversations, a storm was gathering that I could feel as surely as the pain in my bones. The nurses were kind, professional, but they always seemed to glance toward Elaine before answering my questions, as if my daughter were the rightful interpreter of my needs. She visited daily, not with warmth, but with a hovering watchfulness, always ready with a story about my supposed lapses, always eager to remind the staff how fragile I was. I could see the doubt planting itself in the faces of those around me, and I knew that if her narrative went unchallenged for much longer, it would solidify into fact. Each time she leaned down to kiss my forehead, her lips cold, I realized the affection was for the audience, not for me. Patrick appeared less often, but when he did, his role was different. He walked the corridors with restless energy, signing papers, speaking with administrators, smiling with that salesman's charm that had always concealed contempt. I overheard him one evening at the nurses' station speaking about how difficult it had become for Elaine to manage me, how unsafe it was for me to live alone, how perhaps it was time to discuss guardianship. The words cut deeper than the IV needle in my arm, for they were delivered with the calm assurance of someone who had already rehearsed the outcome. They were laying a foundation, brick by brick, and the heat stroke incident was to be their cornerstone. It was a young orderly who gave me the first thread of hope. While checking my vitals late one night, he leaned close and whispered that the shopping center had security cameras everywhere, even in the lot where I had been left. He said it quietly, as though sharing a dangerous secret, and then quickly straightened, leaving me with that single spark of possibility. I lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, imagining that lens capturing Elaine and Patrick, walking away from the car, locking it, abandoning me to the sun. If such footage existed, it would unravel their lies completely. When I was discharged, Elaine insisted on driving me home herself, fussing over me as though I were an invalid, her hand steadying me, though I did not need it. Inside my own house, she walked from room to room, as if inspecting property she already owned, commenting on the dust, the clutter, the supposed hazards. I followed her with tightening fists, saying little, but my mind was racing with a plan. That night, after she left, I sat at my desk and wrote down every detail I could remember: the locked doors, the confiscated phone, the passerby who saved me, the first words Elaine uttered at my bedside when she claimed I had locked myself in. I knew I would need all of it. The following week, I forced myself to the shopping center, moving slowly, still weak, but driven by a determination that outpaced my body. I asked for the security office, introduced myself, and explained what had happened. The guard on duty was reluctant at first, claiming privacy rules, but when I pressed with the weight of desperation in my voice, he finally admitted that footage had been saved because of the incident report filed by the Good Samaritan who had called for help. My heart pounded as he scrolled through digital files, then froze on the image of Elaine and Patrick walking briskly away from the car, Patrick glancing back only once before disappearing from the frame. The camera angle even caught Elaine tucking something into her purse, my phone, in that sterile office with the hum of monitors around me. I felt both fury and vindication rise together. Proof. Solid, undeniable proof that I had not imagined it, that I had not been confused or feeble, that my suffering had been inflicted with callous deliberation. The guard allowed me to request a copy, though it required a formal process. I filed the paperwork on the spot, my hands trembling, knowing that this evidence might be the only barrier between me and the fate Elaine and Patrick had planned. Later that evening, as I sat in my dim living room watching the sun sink low, I felt the weight of the turning point. For months, perhaps years, I had endured the erosion of respect, the small humiliations, the endless taking, telling myself that family was family, that Catherine would have wanted me to forgive. But forgiveness had not preserved my dignity. It had only emboldened them. Nearly dying in that car had stripped away my last illusions, and the security footage was a mirror reflecting the truth I had avoided. My daughter no longer saw me as her father, but as an obstacle, one that needed to be managed, manipulated, or removed. I realized then that this was no longer about reconciliation or even about protecting my property. It was about survival of the self, about proving that my voice still mattered, that my life still belonged to me and not to those who wished to control it. The midpoint of my story was not merely a brush with death, but the discovery of a weapon. And though my hands were old and unsteady, I intended to wield it with every ounce of strength I had left. I had thought that the discovery of the footage would steady the ground beneath my feet, that truth preserved by a silent lens would be enough to halt their advance. Yet the days that followed taught me that people who are determined to take something from you rarely stop because you have proven a point. They simply change tactics. And so the second wave began with an envelope on my porch, fat with photocopies and signatures, a guardian ad litem's card clipped to the front, and a notice that Elaine had filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship, citing increasing confusion, wandering, and unsafe behaviors. All of it dressed in the somber language of concern, and tucked inside was a letter from a physician I had never met in person, a brisk telemedicine practitioner whose cursory notes read like a script Elaine herself might have drafted, recommending supervision and placement for my safety, a recommendation that made my hands shake, not from frailty but from fury, because it was my first proof that this would not be a clash of memories, but a campaign fought with paper and procedure and the quiet arrogance of those who believe an old man cannot push back. I took the packet to the only lawyer whose name meant anything to me, a young woman I remembered as a freshman with a fierce streak, the year I hired her as a library aide, now an elder law attorney with a cramped office above a hardware store and a gaze that could cut through varnish. Her name was Mara Whitaker, and when I set the papers on her desk and told her about the car and the heat and the way Elaine had bent words into cages, she listened without interrupting, then asked to see every note I had made and every scrap of proof I had gathered. And when I mentioned the footage She leaned forward as though a breeze had pushed her chair, explaining in a low, steady voice that evidence like that must be preserved by formal request and backed with sworn statements, that we would need the names of the paramedics and the report filed by the Good Samaritan, that we would need my discharge summary, my vital signs, and any documentation that contradicted the telemedicine fiction they were chasing. And as she spoke, I felt the oddest thing, not quite hope, not even comfort, but the sensation of a spine straightening inside me, as if the old principle had found his footing again after years of being made to shuffle and sit. Mara sent letters that very afternoon, crisp and relentless, instructing the shopping center to preserve the footage under threat of spoliation, requesting the incident report from the ambulance service, demanding the names and contact information of the responders, and notifying Elaine's counsel that we contested guardianship and would seek independent medical evaluation before any hearing. She then called a neurologist she trusted, a measured woman named Dr. Sethi, who took her time with elders and scheduled an in-person assessment, not a perfunctory check of orientation questions, but a thorough evaluation of memory, executive function, and judgment. And while those machines of verification lumbered into motion, the subtler machinery of humiliation continued in my home, because guardianship does not only happen in courtrooms, it begins with phone calls and insinuations and strangers standing on your front step with clipboards. 2 mornings later, a social worker from Adult Protective Services knocked on my door, announced by the polite rigidness of someone who has been told a narrative and must verify whether it is plausible. And I invited her in, poured her water, spoke slowly but not haltingly, showed her the pillbox I filled each Sunday, the calendar with my appointments neatly penciled, the grocery list stuck to the fridge with Catherine's cardinal magnet. And while she glanced around, she asked quiet questions about falls and lost keys and burned pans, and I could see, somewhere behind the professional courtesy, the flicker of surprise when I answered with clarity and calm, when I produced receipts and the hospital discharge notes, when I explained the footage request and the name of my attorney. And when she left, she shook my hand, longer than was necessary, and said that she had been told I was confused, but that she did not find me so, although policy required that she write a report. And after she walked down the steps, I sat at the kitchen table shaking, not from fear now, but from the indignity of needing to prove, room by room, that I could still live in the house I paid for with my working life. Humiliation, like heat, arrives in waves, and the next wave came on a Saturday when 2 men in matching polo shirts appeared with a clipboard from a memory care residence across town saying that Elaine had placed a deposit and that they were here for an intake tour if I would please gather a few essentials. And behind their rehearsed courtesy, I heard the quiet scrape of a cage door. So I asked them to wait while I made a call, and when I reached Mara, she told me firmly to put the men on speaker, to ask them if they had a court order, to ask them whether they understood the liability of attempting to remove a competent adult without consent. And I repeated her questions slowly until the men, their smiles curdling, apologized and backed down the steps, leaving a brochure on the railing as if they might return later, when the law had tightened its fingers around my wrists. I watched their van pull away and realized that manipulation had spilled into logistics, that they were already spending my money as if the ink were dry on a petition that had not yet been heard. That evening, the telephone rang with my son's voice from California. The blue sky optimism filed into a note of weariness, and he said that Elaine had called him in tears, that she was afraid for me, that she had found the stove on and the front door open. And while he spoke, I looked at the stove and the double-locked door and understood that the gas in this story was not the kind that collects in a kitchen, but the kind they spread through a family, invisible and choking. And to my shame, I heard myself defending, explaining, bringing up the Heatwave in the locked car, and my son, who had not been there, who had not felt a seatbelt blister his palm, sighed and said he did not know whom to believe, that he loved me, that surely Elaine would not lie. And when he hung up, I felt something in me let go. Not love for my son, never that, but the belief that either of my children would step between me and a lie, if the lie were comforting. Mara, sensing what isolation does, stepped in with structure as antidote, and she helped me establish a revocable living trust, named for Catherine, placing the house and accounts under the custody of a document that recognized my will while protecting me from sudden grabs. She arranged for a neutral fiduciary to stand ready as a successor trustee of my choosing rather than Elaine's, and she filed a motion to dismiss the emergency guardianship on the grounds that no immediate risk existed, attaching affidavits from the paramedics who had lifted me, from the passerby whose name turned out to be Caleb Ortiz, from the shopping center guard who had preserved the footage, and from Dr. Sethi, who, after a meticulous evaluation that left me mentally spent but vindicated, wrote in crisp professional prose that I exhibited no evidence of dementia and retained capacity to make my own decisions. Mara then sent a preservation notice to my bank after we discovered that someone had attempted to change beneficiaries on my retirement accounts, and the bank's fraud department, awakening at last, froze the request and promised to cooperate with any investigation, though they refused to say out loud the name they had seen on the digital request form, a silence that told me enough. The week before the hearing, someone tried to get into my mailbox, a minor crime to the police, but not a minor blow to me, because it taught me that nothing, not even letters addressed in my name, was assumed to be mine unless I stood on the porch to claim it. I installed a small camera above the door with the help of my neighbor, and 2 nights later the lens caught Patrick's profile as clear as a book cover under a reading lamp, his hand in the mailbox, his head swiveling like a man unused to being watched. And when I printed the stills and carried them to the police department, the officer on duty grew suddenly formal, took my statement and promised to add it to the record. And I found, strangely, that my hands did not shake this time, because anger had hardened into a kind of quiet discipline, the way iron cools into a usable shape after too much beating. Church, once a refuge, became another arena where narratives collided, because Elaine whispered to a few faces I had known for decades that I was slipping, that I needed their prayers, that I was resistant to care, and I watched as sympathy tilted toward her because people want to believe a daughter's voice when it trembles. Yet not everyone swallowed it, and after service, a retired nurse squeezed my shoulder and said with a twinkle that confusion looks and sounds a certain way, and that I did not have it. And an old friend from the school board offered to drive me to the courthouse if I wanted company. And that small chorus of plain-spoken witnesses steadied me more than any sermon could, for it reminded me that truth does not always need a spotlight. Sometimes it only needs a few steady eyes willing to look directly at it. On the eve of the hearing, Elaine called, her voice syrupy and brittle at once, offering to withdraw the petition if I would sign a power of attorney appointing her as my agent for major decisions. And when I asked what counted as major, she said, anything that touched on my safety, my house, or my investments, a circle large enough to swallow a life. And I told her calmly that I had already named someone, that her petition would be met with evidence, that I would not be intimidated into surrender. And the silence that followed stretched long enough for me to imagine her face pinched with incredulity. And then she said the words that finally scalded away whatever softness remained in me, that I had lived long enough, that it was time to stop making everything difficult that I was never good at letting go. And she hung up before I could answer, leaving me alone with the truth of who she had become and the smaller truth of who I had allowed her to be in my life for far too long. I slept little, wandering the rooms that still carried Catherine's scent in the drawers she had lined with paper, and I touched the backs of the chairs she had chosen for our kitchen and thought of how she would have handled this, not by raising her voice, but by raising her spine. And I promised her in the quiet that I would not let our years end in a whimper, signed in triplicate by people who never loved us. And in the morning, I put on the suit I had not worn since her funeral, not as costume, but as armor, tucked a USB drive with the footage into an inside pocket, as if it were a relic, and carried the folder Mara had assembled with the affidavits and still photographs and medical evaluations that together formed a map back to my own. Name? At the courthouse steps, Caleb Ortiz waited with a thermos of coffee and a shy determination. The security guard arrived in his plainclothes jacket, clutching his logbook like a shield. The paramedic nodded to me with the solemn kindness of a man who has seen too much, and Mara, small and focused, gathered us with a glance and said that escalation is just another word for clarity finally being forced into a room where it cannot be ignored. And I believed her, not because the system is noble, but because for once I had more than outrage and memory on my side. I had witnesses who had nothing to gain. I had my mind, and I had the heat wave itself, which had nearly ended me, but had also burned away the last of my hesitation. So when the clerk called our case, and I followed Mara into the echoing chamber that smelled of varnish and old dust, I felt the fear, yes, but I also felt the stubborn heat in my chest that no air conditioner could extinguish the fire of a man who has been taught by punishing weather to endure and by betrayal to speak. And if this was only the second escalation, then let it be the one where the quiet man finally made a sound they could not mistake for confusion. The courthouse was a cold place, not by temperature, but by design, a building meant to strip away personality and turn every human life into lines on a docket. I sat at the long table beside Mara, my hands folded on the folder that contained the sum of my survival, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, because the temptation to rage, to shout, to pound my fists was strong enough to shake my chest. Across from me, Elaine and Patrick whispered together. Their lawyer, a slick man in a sharp suit, with eyes like wet marbles, shuffling his papers with the smug rhythm of someone who believed the ending had already been written. Elaine avoided my eyes, though I caught her once staring at me with a mixture of impatience and disdain, as if I were a stubborn patient refusing treatment, as if this were all an inconvenience delaying her victory. The judge entered with the solemnity of habit, and the proceedings began with their attorney painting a portrait of me so grotesquely inaccurate I nearly laughed. A portrait of a confused old man who left stoves burning, who locked himself in cars, who wandered into the street without remembering where he was going. Each falsehood slid into the record with practiced ease, each one spoken with the cadence of compassion rather than accusation, as though this theft of my autonomy were a gift. When Elaine was called to speak, she did so with trembling voice and eyes dampened by false tears, telling the court how worried she had been, how sleepless nights consumed her because she feared for my safety, how the Heatwave incident had broken her heart because she found me incoherent and panicked after somehow locking myself in. I sat still, my jaw clenched, as she recited the script we both knew by heart, a story rehearsed long before the sun had nearly cooked me alive. Patrick added his own embellishments, describing how he had rushed back to the car that day and found me delirious, how he had tried to open the door but I had resisted, how my memory had faltered again and again in recent months. It was a performance, smooth and persuasive, and for a moment I felt the dread that perhaps words alone could condemn me, because words are cheap and quick, and the truth is slow and heavy, and courtrooms often prefer efficiency to accuracy. Then it was Mara's turn, and the temperature of the room shifted. She spoke with calm precision, dismantling the portrait piece by piece, not with rhetoric, but with facts laid carefully like stones in a wall. She introduced the affidavit from Dr. Sethi, describing in clinical detail how I had passed every cognitive assessment, how I demonstrated intact judgment, memory, and reasoning, and how the supposed confusion had no medical basis. She called the paramedic, who stood tall in his uniform, and recounted how I had been pulled from the car, locked from the outside, not the inside, and how my condition was consistent with prolonged entrapment in heat rather than voluntary error. Caleb Ortiz testified next, nervous but steady, describing how he had seen me trapped and had run for help, how he had watched Elaine and Patrick walk away casually, not rushing back as they claimed, and how his conscience had not allowed him to ignore the sight of an elderly man pounding on the window of a sealed car. Finally came the footage, played on a grainy monitor at the front of the room, and there it was, undeniable, the image of Elaine and Patrick walking briskly away, Patrick pressing the key fob, Elaine slipping my phone into her purse, their bodies shrinking in the distance while the car sat immobile in the sun. The silence in the courtroom as that footage played was heavy, a silence of revelation, of lies unraveling, of masks falling. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression sharpening from neutrality into something harder, something that hinted at disapproval. When Mara finished, she rested her hand lightly on my arm, a signal that it was time. She had asked me earlier whether I wished to speak, and though my throat had tightened at the thought, I had agreed, because silence was no longer an option. I rose slowly, every joint protesting, but I stood tall, looking not at Elaine or Patrick, but at the judge, and then at the strangers who would decide whether I was to be erased. My voice was rough at first, but it steadied as I spoke. I told them about the heat, about the way the air thickened until I could not breathe, about the shame of realizing my own daughter had left me to suffer. I told them about Catherine, about the life we had built, about the values we tried to instill in our children, and about the heartbreak of watching those values twisted into greed. I did not shout, I did not weep, but I let the weight of truth carry itself in the slow cadence of a man who has nothing left to lose but his dignity. At one point, Elaine muttered something to her lawyer, shaking her head, but I ignored her. I explained how, in the hospital bed, too weak to fight, I heard her tell the doctor that I was confused, that I imagined things, and how I realized then that my survival was not her relief, but her inconvenience. I ended with a simple statement, not rehearsed, but born from the marrow of my bones. I may be old, Your Honor, but I am not lost. I may be slower than I once was, but I know who I am, and I know what was done to me, and I will not surrender the life I still have to those who see me only as a set of assets to be harvested. When I sat down, the courtroom was silent again, but it was a different silence than before, not one of doubt, but of recognition. The judge took his time before speaking, his eyes fixed on Elaine and Patrick, and when he did, his words cut cleanly. The petition was denied, the guardianship dismissed, and a referral was made to the state's attorney for investigation of possible elder abuse and financial exploitation. Elaine's face drained of color, Patrick's jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw fear in their expressions. Not fear of me, but fear of consequence. As the gavel struck, finalizing what I already felt in my chest, I closed my eyes and drew a long breath, the first breath in months that did not taste of dread or humiliation. The climax of this struggle was not victory. In the grand sense, there would be appeals, investigations, cold silences in the family that would never heal. But it was victory enough. The reclamation of my voice, my name, and the proof that I was not yet erased. In the weeks after the hearing, the rhythm of my days returned slowly, though nothing was the same, because once you see your own child stand against you in a court of law, weaving lies with a steady voice, there is no return to the innocence of trust. The house felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because every chair, every picture frame, every corner seemed to whisper Catherine's absence, more insistently, now that I knew how fully Elaine had abandoned her mother's teachings, and lighter because the immediate threat had passed. The guardianship had been dismissed, and for the first time in years, I could sip my morning coffee without the taste of dread clinging to it. Freedom does not always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a breeze through an open window, and you realize only then how stifling the air had been before. Elaine did not call again, not after the judge's ruling, and not after the referral for investigation. Word reached me through the small town channels that she was furious, that she told friends and relatives I had turned on her, that I had been manipulated by outsiders into distrusting my own blood. It hurt. Of course it did, because there is no armor strong enough to make a father immune to the sting of being called a traitor by his child. Yet there was also relief in the silence, because I had lived too long under the shadow of her demands and her false sweetness. Patrick, for his part, was seen less around town, his smile dimmed, his confidence punctured, and though I knew they would scheme again in some form, I also knew the law now had their names in ink, and their next steps would not be taken in darkness. I spent more time on the porch after that, not waiting for anyone, not hoping for a visit, but simply watching the world with the eyes of a man who had come close to being erased and had managed to remain. Neighbors waved more often. Some stopped to ask how I was, and though pity clung to their voices, I accepted it, because pity from a stranger is easier to carry than betrayal from your own blood. At church, the whispers shifted. Those who had once nodded sympathetically at Elaine now looked at me with quiet respect, perhaps even guilt, for believing her too easily, and a few apologized outright. I told them no apology was needed, because what mattered was not how they had doubted me, but how they looked at me now, as a man still capable, still himself. The greatest change was within me. For years I had lived bent toward compromise, telling myself that Catherine would want peace, that forgiveness was a form of love. But I had learned that forgiveness offered without accountability is not virtue, but surrender. And surrender had nearly cost me my life. I began to reclaim not only my independence, but my sense of agency. I worked with Mara to update my will and trust, not out of spite, but out of clarity, directing what I had built toward causes that would outlast me, causes that would honor Catherine's compassion instead of feeding Elaine's greed. A scholarship in Catherine's name at the local high school, a donation to the senior center that had too few resources, and a clear provision that nothing of mine would pass to those who tried to hasten my decline. It was not revenge, but justice, a quiet redistribution of love toward those who might value it. Nights were still difficult. I woke sometimes with the memory of the suffocating heat, the taste of my own breath trapped in the car, the helpless pounding of my fist against unyielding glass. Yet even those nightmares carried a strange kind of strength, because each time I remembered, I also remembered that I had survived, that I had risen in court, that I had spoken when silence was easier. Age takes much from a man, but it also pares him down to essentials, and I had discovered at my core something I had almost forgotten, the ability to endure and to resist. On the anniversary of Catherine's passing, I drove myself to the cemetery, the late summer sun warm but not cruel. And I sat by her stone for hours, speaking aloud as though she sat beside me. I told her everything, not sparing details, because I owed her the truth. And as I spoke, I felt the anger drain from me, leaving something steadier in its place. She would not have wanted me to waste what remained of my days in bitterness. She would have wanted me to stand, to live, to keep the dignity she had always seen in me, even when I could not see it myself. When I rose to leave, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I had forgotten, but because I had finally understood. Justice had been served, not in punishment alone, but in survival, in reclaiming the narrative of my own life. I do not know how many years remain for me, but I know this: they will be mine. They will not be dictated by a daughter who mistook control for love, nor stolen by a son too distant to see the truth, nor eroded by whispers of confusion and decline. They will be the years of a man who was left to die in the heat, yet walked into the cold heart of a courthouse and lit it with truth. I may be old, but I am still here, and as long as I breathe, I will decide what my life means. That, in the end, is the only inheritance worth leaving behind.